Like business as usual, another day at the farm.
The so-called Manson family was a sort of parody of patriarchy. So part of the revelation was that you could be living in a commune and do all these hip things, and yet and still be the incarnation of some, very primitive form of social organization, which was not a transcendent improvement upon the normal American family, but rather something barbaric.
The murderers were caught 250 miles away from Los Angeles, near the small town of Independence. They were arrested for stealing cars. It was only when one of the killers, Susan Atkins, confessed to a cellmate that police connected the family with the murders.
I was a California Highway Patrolman assigned to the California Highway Patrol office at Oakland, California. And during the 60s in the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Area, there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of demonstrations and riots all over the Bay Area. And I transferred from that area up here to a quiet area. And 2 months later, that's when we went on the Manson raids in Gold Wash.
I learned about the Manson situation when my boss came into the office one day and said that law enforcement had received some rumors or reports of people out in the desert, namely out in and around the Panamint Mountains in the southern part of the county, running around in dune buggies, sex orgies, drugs, random sharing of affection, doing things that just weren't quite accepted here in Inyo County.
I searched the building, and in the small bathroom area, in a commode under the sink, the door began opening, and this figure crawled out. He had been in a fetal position in the cupboard, crawled out and stood up in front of me and said, "Hi." And at that time, I asked him who he was, identify himself, and he told me, Charlie Manson.
In court, the prosecution claimed Manson had convinced his followers that they should come to Death Valley to breed a master race to take over America. The jury was told and believed that Helter Skelter, the group's so-called philosophy, was Manson's response to what he saw as an inevitable race war.
On the way down, he impressed upon us that his group was trying to find some place to be alone because the blacks were going to rise up and overwhelm the whites. There was going to be a bloodbath, and he stressed that we, in uniform, number one, were cops, number two, we were white, therefore we had 2 strikes against us immediately, and he strongly recommended that we let them go and we flee for our lives.
Helter Skelter is what? Race war? How long has there been a race war? How long have we been in race war? English? How long have we been at war with races? Since we come out of the caves and you didn't like Irishmen? It's been a race war. All my life I've been in the middle of a race war.
What Manson and the family wanted to do is when they saw that the blacks weren't starting the revolution, they wanted to start the revolution and blame the murders on blacks, and they wanted the murders to be so horrible that whites would get incensed and start going down into the black communities and start killing blacks in retaliation.
The word pig was printed in blood on the front door of the Tate residence, and the words "death to pigs" were printed in blood on the living room wall at the La Bianca residence. The word pig in 1969, in the 70s, it became a word used by the counterculture movement. But in 1969, pig was a word used by groups like the Black Panthers, the black activists.
No more brothers in jail.
In 1966, in Oakland, outside San Francisco, radical young black Americans had formed the Black Panthers to police the police. They were uniformed, disciplined, and to the amazement of American society, patrolled their neighborhoods with guns.
People followed the lead of the Black Panthers, who were considered the vanguard. Most of the movement was white and middle class. And there was a lot of guilt about racism. And it was felt that black people and other minorities, they'd been living under the worst conditions in our society. And they had to resort to violence, whereas maybe white middle-class kids could often be pacifists because their lives weren't threatened in the same way. Cops would much more willingly hold a gun to the head of a minority person and be more violent toward them.
The image of the Black Panthers was when they went to the legislative meetings and they had their guns because it was legal. And that image scared a lot of white America because they saw blacks with guns. Even though it was legal, it was a scary image. And Manson played into that fear by trying to blame his crimes on the Black Panthers. Any con man knows that you have to take something that has a level of credibility to it. So Manson exploited the fear of white America by blaming his crimes on blacks.
As long as I can reach in your mind and control your fear because you're a coward, I'm going to play any game I can play on you all the way to the White House. And then when I take over, I'm going to laugh and say, you were a bunch of weak people. I don't see how you made it this far.
John is in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government. The man in a train.
In the days before Manson's arrest, a wave of bombings took place in Chicago. Responsibility was claimed by a student group called the Weathermen, who took their name from a line in a Bob Dylan song. The days of peaceful protests had ended.
In the latter part of '69, the Weathermen faction declared that they'd cut all ties to civilization, that they were admirers of Charles Manson, that sticking a fork in a person's belly was something to go wow about. Wild was the word they used. And they shared with Manson the sense of the necessity to go beyond, to be as outrageous as possible. And that's why the Weathermen celebrated Charles Manson. They named Sharon Tate an enemy for no apparent reason than that Charles Manson had been complicit in murdering her. And they declared that Manson was the incarnation of this spirit of transgression, or the sense that whoever did something wild and as outrageous as possible was a comrade in arms.
I just remember a magazine, I think it was called Tuesday's Child or something, and I guess they labeled the 1969 as the year of the fork, because when Pat Krenwinkel left a fork in Lino LaBianca's stomach, she wrote war on his, I believe it was his belly, the fork might have been in his chest, and when questioned on the stand why she did that, she said, this is one man who won't be sending his son to war. So the war being a big issue in the 60s with, you know, many, many people, that's probably why they chose to adopt Charlie as a, what do you call it, hero.
I look back and I feel embarrassed by the enthusiasm with which I regarded the Weather Underground for a short period of time. So these are mistakes. I never did anything violent. I was never aligned with them. There were moments when you heard that maybe the Capitol had been bombed or a building had been bombed, that property had been bombed, and I was happy, and I don't regret that. That was wonderful.
This is revolution, that there is absolutely no justification, and that the only thing you can say about the perpetrators of these outrages are they are typical of Hitlerian stormtroopers, and I think we've had enough of that for one lifetime.
The 60s had reached its violent conclusion. On May the 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen shot 4 students dead and wounded 9 others at Kent State University, Ohio, after a university building was set on fire. By then, over 100 student strikes were in progress following America's invasion of Cambodia. The following day, there were over 1,000. 1 month later, Manson and his family went on trial. Peace and love had been forsaken and forgotten.
We're for real. My friends went all the way to the gas chamber, to death row, for brother, for love of brother, to stop the war, and for a lot of the causes that other people were espousing in those times. When we were for real, and we did do it in the road and all those things, all the people that were saying they wanted to stop the war and revolution and all that, they turned their backs on us and went to the bank or the school or whatever. They were fakes and frauds. Jane Fonda, Joan Baez, Tom Hayden, all that scum were faking, and they were getting the kids, they were instigating the youth to do these things, and they were making money off of it. It's the same, it's still happening. You got people selling crime and violence and causes and whatever, and all they're really doing is making money. But the young with the heart and the soul and the care, they go out and do something for real, and then people point their finger and call them evil, bad, nasty, and crazy, and drug-soaked, and all these things. You know.
Once a year in California, hippies old and new gather at the University of Davis. The imagery is the same, only the memories have changed.
There's a T-shirt now that says, "Charlie was not a surfer." And it would seem esoteric to somebody who wouldn't even know what it represents, but Manson's name became an icon, just like Woodstock. It was a generic term, and in surfing, it meant a reckless, crazy surfer. So if somebody would say, that guy's a Manson, so young surfers would think, oh, Charles Manson must have been a surfer, which is why there is now that T-shirt that says, Charlie was not a surfer, sort of like Nixon saying, I'm not a crook.
And he was not a hippie.
Manson was not a hippie. He was not a hippie, he was not a surfer. He was the Frankenstein product of the American prison system and brought all their values of racism and violence out of prison with him into the society.
Manson and I used to have several conversations, and he told me at the end of the trial, after the verdict of death came in, he says, you know, Bugliosi, he says, you haven't achieved anything. He says, all you've done is send me back to where I came from. And I said, well, yeah, Charlie, but as far as I know, you haven't been in the green room before. The green room is the room at San Quentin, where they have the death penalty, although he claims to have been resurrected several times. In any event, we jump ahead now, a year later. I'm driving my car, 1972. The car radio's on, and I hear that the U.S. Supreme Court had set aside the death penalty, made all of their rulings retroactive. And the first thing that came into my mind is what Manson had told me. All I had done was send him back to where he came from. And he doesn't mind prison life. I mean, most of his life's been spent behind bars. He's totally institutionalized. He gets out in 1967, may be responsible for 35 murders, convicted of 9, may be responsible for 35, and all we've done is send him back to where he came from. In a sense, and I hate to say this, but in a sense, Manson has beaten the rap. He's beaten the rap. So that's the first thing that I thought about what Charlie told me. He says, you haven't achieved anything at all.
Is he sorry? Well, I don't. You know, let's say this. Am I honest? You know, I can say